Good evening. So good to see you tonight. Thank you very much for coming back out this evening. It is Jamie and my privilege to be here. We just have been blessed. The accommodations at the motel have been very, very nice. And then we were greeted with a gift basket and just very thoughtful things. And then we've been, I can't say wined and dined, we've been fed very well today by both of your pastors, and it's just been sweet fellowship. We're very thankful for that. We are in the 17th century, and we studied John Bunyan this morning. One addendum to that is that I did not recommend a biography, and I should have, because there is a great biography of John Bunyan. There are quite a few, actually, but by far the best one is by a British biographer by the name of Faith Cook. She's up in years now. She's been working with Ian Murray over in England writing biographies for the last 30 or 40 years. But her biography of Bunyan, called Fearless Pilgrim, is well worth reading. You'll learn a lot more than I was able to share with you this morning. I wish there was a biography of William Kiffin, which is comparably good. There actually isn't. But there is a short biography of him called Stranger Than Fiction. Stranger Than Fiction. It's a short book, but it tells the story reasonably well. It's by a scholar by the name of Ramsbottom, who was a church historian in England for a number of years and just passed away actually a few months ago. Tonight, I'd like to tell you the story of a contemporary of Bunyan. Bunyan was born in 1628. William Kiffin was born in 1616, so he's 12 years older. And that's William Kiffin. And I have a theme, a specific theme, that I'd like to get across tonight. I hope it doesn't come across as too preachy, but I'm going to tell his story, but I really have something I want to get through to you. And that is that every servant of God is given two gifts. He is given gifts and opportunities, and he's given trials and suffering. And both of those can tempt us to love ourselves more than we love God. Our gifts and opportunities can fill us with ourselves, and we can forget that they're gifts. And our trials and suffering can drive us into ourselves, and we can lose their purpose. And one of the things that I love about William Kiffin was that God is going to give him an extraordinary array of gifts and opportunities. And he's going to put him through an extraordinary array of trials and suffering. And while he was a regular person, and we're going to see that tonight, nevertheless, both of those were consecrated to the Lord and used by the Lord in just magnificent ways in his life. And I believe he can be an example for us, both relative to our gifts, what we can do and what we are entrusted with, and relative to the suffering that we go through. He was born in 1616, and the name Kiffin is kind of Welsh, so he may have been born over near Wales. I've highlighted it there in a map of the British Isles. We're not really sure. We know almost nothing about his parents. We don't know their names. We don't know the day of his birth. It's remarkable how little we know. It's rather obscure. What we do know is that his parents moved to London by 1625, so sometime during his first 9 years. But 1625 was not a good year to be in London because the plague hit. And it was devastating. It was more devastating than the plague of 1664 that we talked about this morning. That is, during Kiffin's life, there are going to be like 3 major plague attacks on London. The worst of those was 1625. Estimates range as high as 1/3 of the people in London dying, which is almost inconceivable. So if you have any wealth, you get out of town, and that's what people did. House of Lords, everybody who had money would go out of London and wait for it to, everybody who was poor would just try to survive. And both of Kiffin's parents died, and he was orphaned as a 9-year-old. But his parents apparently had some wealth. Again, we don't know what, they weren't nobility, but by this time in history there was a bit of a growing mercantile class, and you could have wealth without being one of the noble families. But he had relatives, and the relatives seized all his fortune. Not only that, he developed a couple of the tumors And when you got the tumors, that usually meant that you were going to be dead in 2 or 3 days, and it was usually agonizing. They didn't have any treatment for it. They just hoped you'd survive. And little Kiffin got better. That is, the Lord healed him of it. He wasn't a believer. As far as we can tell, these were not religious families. I mean, they went to the Anglican church. Everybody went to the Anglican church, but love for God had no role in their home. But he got better, and his relatives decided to stick him into an apprenticeship because there were a lot of businesses that worked kids very young. And they would put 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds to work in their factories. And so Kiffin got a job in a brewery. And it's stinky work and a bunch of kids doing tasks, and they lived in dormitories on the property, and he worked in the brewery. And he hated it. You know, probably most of the boys did. And one day, he decided to escape. And we don't know how old he was, maybe 14. He doesn't say how old he was. I mean, his autobiography is more rambling than Bunyan's. But he decides to escape. And early in the morning, before lights are up, he crawls out, sneaks out of the building, makes his way into London, and I don't know what his plan was there. You know, what's he going to do in the big city of London to survive? Well, at this time, and we're now into the mid-1630s, by the mid-1630s, Puritans are in this life and death struggle with the government of Charles I as to who is going to claim the heart of England. It's going to lead to war in 1640. But in the mid-1630s, Puritans are being denied pulpits. They can't get parish churches. The government church is controlling the parishes, and the Puritans, even though many of them have excellent educations and are great preachers, they have a very hard time getting the parish ministries. So what the Puritans do is pretty creative. They launch a bunch of lectureships. And Tuesday morning at 5, and Thursday morning at 5 in the morning, and Wednesday afternoons when you get off work, and Friday afternoons when you get off work, and Saturday afternoon, they're holding these lectures around London in which they're preaching through books of the Bible. Some of the great famous Puritan sermons series are preached in these lectureships. And people who find their Anglican rector on Sunday boring to tears can go hear a Puritan preacher on Tuesday morning and Wednesday afternoon and Saturday, and the Puritan influence is spreading rapidly. Well, Kiffin, I'll try not to do that tonight. Kiffin, as this teenager, is wandering the streets of London, and he hears a church service going on, and he wanders in there, and it's a Puritan preacher. And in the providence of God, he's preaching on Ephesians 6, "Servants, submit yourselves to your masters, and not as men pleasers, but as to God," and scares scares Kiffin to death. Scares him to death. He runs back to the brewery, sneaks back into the dormitory, the lights turn on, there he is, nobody's ever the wiser. But it gives him a taste for Puritan preaching. The brewery, believe it or not, required all their boys to go to the Anglican parish every Sunday, because that's what you do. It's the state church. But Kiffin starts looking for Puritan preachers to listen to. And one after another, he finds them, and he becomes devoted to their preaching. And he decides to launch a Bible study in the dormitory, 5 a.m. He gathers the boys, and he's studying the Bible, and he starts teaching the Bible to his fellow dorm students. And in all of this process, he gets saved. And I wish I could tell you exactly when. It's real unclear in his biography, but he got saved. He clearly got saved. His relatives at some point shifted him from the brewery to a leatherworking shop, and he finished out an apprenticeship there. And he was already fed up with the Anglican Church. And he connects with some people in London, in downtown London, who are members of this separatist assembly, this church which rejects the Anglican Church. It's not strictly legal, but they are preaching the gospel, and he finds their preaching really favorable. He really loves it. He thinks he's growing in the Lord. And as the persecution gets more intense, that church, which historians today call the JLJ Church. I'm not going to give you a lot of background. Their first three pastors' names started with J, L, and J. All right, so that's just a nickname. But the L is pastoring now, and Kiffin starts to be involved in this church, and then the church splits into a bunch of parts. Why? Because they don't want to all get arrested. And they split into little house churches scattered around London. Several of those splits, 4 or 5 of them, are in the process of analyzing what a church should be. One of them lands on Devonshire Square in London. It's a house church, but they call themselves the Devonshire Square Church, and Kiffin is part of that. And this process, let me just explain it a little bit. The Puritans believe in a state church, but they think the state church should be run by the pastors, not by the government. And the government says, hey, if you're a state church, we're going to be involved. And so a lot of Puritans begin separating and becoming separatists. Once you're a separatist church, you're not part of the parish anymore. And some of these pastors, some of these lay people, start asking this question. If we're not part of the parish anymore, and the way we joined the parish was by being sprinkled as a baby, is infant baptism legitimate? And that ecclesiological question caused them to read the New Testament again with different eyes. That is, if you believe in infant baptism, you can read the Bible and find it, because you're reading the Bible considering circumcision to be infant baptism, and they misinterpret everything because that's the way they're thinking. If you start reading it saying, I wonder if infant baptism is here, guess what you find? Well, we're Baptists. There's no infant baptism in the New Testament at all. There's not one single example of a child being baptized. And a number of these separatist churches in the late 1630s and early 1640s begin embracing believer baptism. This is the beginning of the particular Baptist denomination. Kiffin is in one of those. And Kiffin says, by diligently searching the Scriptures, with earnest desires of God, I sought that I might be directed in a right way of worship. And after some time, concluded that the safest way was to follow the footsteps of the flock, namely, that order laid down by Christ and his apostles and practiced by the primitive Christians in their times. What a novel idea. Let's worship the way they did in Acts. Maybe that'll help us. Let's figure out what the New Testament teaches, which I found to be that after conversion, they were baptized, added to the church, and continued in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. It's not an accident that Acts 2:41-48 is one of the most important passages to Baptists in the whole Bible. Because there it is. That's how you do it. You win people to Christ. You baptize them. You add them to the church. And Kiffin became a Baptist. That was about 1638. And the Devonshire Square Church asked him to be their pastor. It was a big year for him. But also, he married, he married Hannah. I'd love to tell you just this beautiful story about how he met and fell in love with Hannah. But like I said this morning, they never tell us these stories. All right, they're not nearly as interested in the romance as we are. He says one thing about Hannah. I love this. Quote, she was with me in judgment. That is, she read the Bible correctly. She was willing to come out and be persecuted. She was willing to join me in this work. I think I'll marry her. God is going to bless them. They're going to have a daughter, and they're going to name her Hannah, first daughter. They're going to have a son named William. They're going to have a second son, who he never names. They're going to have a second daughter, who he never names. They're going to have a third daughter named Rebecca, and then a final third son named Henry. So God bless them with 3 boys and 3 girls, and a couple of them will come up a little later in our study. But this is a particular Baptist church, that it's a Calvinistic Baptist church. The early Baptists divided into General Baptists, who tended to be Arminian, particular Baptists, who tended to be Calvinistic. These were Calvinistic, particular Baptists, but they were very evangelistic, very passionate about winning Englishmen to Christ. And Kiffin, by 1641, is installed as the pastor as a 25-year-old, and you say, wait a minute, what qualifications does this guy have to be a pastor? You got to be kidding me. He has no training, he has no education, he has no ordination. Well, welcome to life in 17th century particular Baptist circles. That is, there are no schools for them to go to. They're forbidden from going to the Anglican schools. They're not going to start their own school for several years, and it's going to be all the way over in Western England where they can't get to it, in Bristol. But Kiffin was a gifted exhorter. He knew his Bible. He had been studying it since he was a teenager, and he was studying it hard, and he had endured suffering. In fact, right about that time, he got sick again. Very sick. Bedridden sick for several months. And his wife thought she was going to be a widow after being married for less than 5 years. And he thought he was going to die. And God raised him from the sick bed a second time. And in his autobiography, he says, I was convinced at that point that by the age of 25, I had been preserved from illnesses that the doctors thought were going to kill me on 2 occasions. God's got something for me to do. I believe I've got an important task ahead of me. But Charles I was an extremely intolerant ruler, and his archbishop was William Laud. And William Laud has decided he's going to persecute anyone who does not conform to the Anglican Church. A lot of separatists and Baptists are fleeing the country. Devonshire Square doesn't want to do that. Probably the best place in England to hide is in London. That is, if you're out in the countryside, it's not hard to find you. In London, it's teeming. It's twice as big as the second biggest city in England, and there are so many people that maybe you can avoid detection. And for a while they did. And then they arrested Kiffin. They arrested him for holding an illegal conventicle. That is, you are convening against the law, you're not doing any of the things we require, you're not ordained, you're under arrest. And at his trial, Kiffin said, though I am accused and condemned for being at a conventicle, truly, if praying for the king and parliament, and edifying one another in our most holy faith, be keeping conventicles, then I'm guilty. But if a conventicle be such a meeting as in the least measure is against any of these, then I detest it and abhor it. That is, we are not gathering together to oppose the king. We're gathered together to edify one another, and we pray for the king every week. Well, all Kiffin tells us is that they arrested him and he gave that statement. Apparently they let him go. And in 1644, he's been at the church now for 6 years, he's been pastoring it for 3. He and 6 other pastors there in London came together and published the London Confession of Faith. The London Confession of Faith is the first public document produced by the modern Baptist denomination expressing our beliefs. Look it up. It's short. It's a short little document. And its main purpose was to say, we are not crazy people. We're not like the Anabaptists you've heard of that launched rebellions over on the continent. Now, most Anabaptists were sweet, kind, innocent people. But there were some Anabaptists who had done some crazy stuff. And these Baptists were saying, that's not what we're about. We are good, faithful, honest Englishmen. We would like to have all the privileges of being Englishmen. But we don't think the church and the government should be working together. And here was the bombshell, we have become convinced that baptism is only scriptural baptism when it's a believer and it's by immersion. And they were hated for that. Because that, with a stroke of the pen, they declare all Anglicans, all Presbyterians, everybody is now declared to be in disobedience to the command of Scripture to be baptized. Now, the Baptists were usually pretty gentle about this. They would say, you're not exercising your will in opposition to God, you're simply misunderstanding the Scriptures, which of course made everybody feel a lot better. You're not a rebel, you're just ignorant. Right? People hated the Baptists for this. And the Baptists were pretty much the only group at the time that was making this claim. that they're the only scripturally baptized people in England. And sometimes we might be embarrassed by that claim unless we study the scriptures and discover that biblical baptism is of a believer by immersion. That is, they had recovered biblical polity. And it's not that they were the first to teach it in the last 1,600 years, but the modern denomination gathered around that teaching. It's 1644. He's 28 years old, and I've told you his background. He's an orphan who has made his way into the faith kind of late, and somebody published an attack on it and said, watch out for that William Kiffin. He is the author and grand ringleader of that seduced sect. And you get some indication here that Kiffin is emerging as quite the leader. Well, this morning we talked about the Civil War. Civil War is ongoing, Parliament against the king. And Parliament is much more tolerant of people like Kiffin. And in fact, Kiffin volunteers to join the army, and they make him an officer. And he's an officer in the Parliamentary Army for a few years. It's in that role that he is given a unique opportunity. Charles I, in 1649, was captured by the parliamentary forces. They put him on trial. They accused him of murdering his own people. And Kiffin requested permission to meet with the king. And they let him in. And he met with Charles I. And Kiffin said, Your Majesty, I am here representing the Baptists across your domain. We have been praying for you. We will support your exoneration, your release, if you'll promise us that the government will stop persecuting us. We don't know what Charles said. We don't know what Charles said. And it would have been moot anyway, because Cromwell and the government beheaded him. Kiffin and the Baptists were deeply saddened by the execution of King Charles. One of the reasons Kiffin was given that opportunity was that he also was a businessman to support himself. His church couldn't pay him a salary. I don't know of a Baptist pastor in the 17th century that was able to be supported by salary. They all had to be tent makers. They all had to work. And he got involved in wool merchant, as a wool merchant. And he tells the story of taking a couple of dozen pounds of money and crossing the ocean to the Netherlands to work a deal so that he could be a middleman to get wool product from all the vast sheep farms to the business people in Antwerp and Brussels and whatnot. And he says, and I went across the channel with a couple of dozen pounds. When I came home, it was 2,000 or 3,000 pounds. It was a pretty good business deal. And he was really good at business. He's going to head up what we would call a middleman in the textile industry, where he is arranging shipment between these wool merchants and these markets. And he does extremely well. I mean, extremely well. And we've traveled in England, and there are sheep everywhere. I'm told now that they're not primarily for the wool, they're primarily for the mutton. But back then it was a massive industry in England. And Kiffin later says, God gave me more of the world than ever I could have thought to have enjoyed. He also said, God has given me, I was able to give without receiving, which I bless the Lord, he hath in some measure given me a heart to do. Suddenly, he was a Baptist orphan pastor, and he's filthy rich. I tell my Baptist Heritage students, enjoy this. We're not going to discuss very many rich Baptists. All right, that is, the Baptist history is not littered with these wealthy people. He was filthy rich, which allowed him in a fairly short time to hire managers to run his business and to give himself to reading and studying the scriptures. He pastored his church with no salary, and he used his wealth to help suffering Baptists. And he became a major benefactor to hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. And it's hard to ignore a guy like that. And in fact, Cromwell won the Civil War, and through a complicated process, he became the Lord Protector and sort of ran England for a few years. And while he was ruling England, he became friends with this rich wool merchant who happened to be a Baptist. And Kiffin and Cromwell hit it off, and Cromwell actually appointed him to be the tax assessor for Middlesex. Well, a Baptist being a tax assessor? You say, well, who would want to do that? It was a nice job, and he did it with honesty. Furthermore, Kiffin went to Cromwell and said, you know, according to the laws that your government has put in place, even though you're allowing me to preach, you're only allowing me to preach in a parish. We don't believe in parishes. Do you mind if I go preach in Middle England? There are people in the center of England that would like me to come preach for them. And Cromwell said, yeah, why not? And he and his close friend Hansard Knowles were given dispensations to preach anywhere in England that they wanted. First time any Baptist has been allowed to do that. Now, Bunyan was traveling all around doing it, but it was all illegal. And so he's traveling around preaching. And during Cromwell's reign, the Baptists absolutely thrived. But there are still all these old laws on the books. And during the Protectorate, one day, Kiffin gets a knock on the door, and a marshal is there and said, we have been told, somebody had informed on him, that you are preaching against the baptism of infants. You're under arrest. And he's like, Mr. Cromwell knows what I'm, and they dragged him off to jail. Second time he's been arrested. So he sits in jail for a few days. He goes to trial, and the judge who was appointed to hear the case was the Lord Mayor of England. And the Lord Mayor comes in and says, who's on the docket? And they said, Mr. William Kiffin. And the Lord Mayor knew Kiffin and knew how wealthy he was and knew how much Cromwell liked him. And the Lord Mayor said, too busy today to hear this case, suspended indefinitely. And Kiffin was never brought back to trial on that offense. So things were going pretty well until 1658, as I mentioned, Oliver Cromwell passed away. He was actually asked to be king. And Cromwell said, England doesn't need a king. We are a protectorate. We are a commonwealth. I will not be king. And then when he died, his son succeeded him, which looks suspiciously like royalty. But his son, Richard Cromwell, was not Oliver. He had no executive abilities. Things started unraveling very quickly. Richard Cromwell didn't even formally advocate. He just fled. He just fled the country, went to France, lived there for years. He was a believer. I think we're all going to meet Richard Cromwell. He snuck back into the country later and actually was a member of Isaac Watts' church. All right. But the country just goes into pandemonium, terrible turmoil, and a religious group emerged that were known as the Fifth Monarchists. Based on the book of Daniel, where you've got these four great kingdoms, and then one day a fifth kingdom shall come, ruled over by Christ, that destroys all the other kingdoms. And these fifth monarchists completely misunderstood that text and said, what we need to do is overthrow the kingdoms of this world so that Christ can come back. And they advocated revolutionary tactics, including violence. They were behind a lot of rough stuff. And they were just revolutionary enough that a lot of the established people said, I wonder if these Baptists are actually fifth monarchists. And the Baptists got mixed up with them. There were one or two Baptists who had been fifth monarchists, but there's no connection. But it was an excuse now for Kiffin to get arrested again. He was arrested by that man. He's usually called Admiral Monk, but Admiral meant general back then. That is, it wasn't because he was over the Navy. And Monk decided that Kiffin, this Baptist, was too big for his britches, and he was suspected him of being a revolutionary, had him arrested, accused him of supplying the fifth monarchists, had him incarcerated for several days, and then Monk's investigators said, we can't find any evidence of that, sir. We're going to have to let him go. And they let him go. Third time he's been arrested now. Well, in 1660, Charles II comes back to the throne. We learned about that this morning. And Charles II made all kinds of promises, but Parliament now is in the hands of anti-Puritans, anti-nonconformists, and Parliament wants to get even. And one of their targets is this rich Baptist. One thing about being wealthy and high profile, everybody knows about you, and they go after him. And shortly after Charles II comes to the throne, he's arrested for the 4th time. This time, the charges are treason, and he's dragged before the Privy Council. The Privy Council is like the cabinet that our president has. It's the highest rulers in the land. And there's Kiffin answering to the Privy Council. He's not even allowed to defend himself. They commit him to prison. And when the Chief Justice of the land presides over the court case, they produce a document signed by Kiffin that is extremely incriminating, that says that he has been treasonous against King Charles II. And Kiffin's sitting on the bench, says, "Can I see that?" And he's reading through it, and from a first look, he says, I couldn't have done that. I was, and he said, I was such and such a place, and I can give you 50 witnesses such a place. And I wouldn't have written that. I mean, if you compare what I write, and he proved it was a forgery from the stand. And the Chief Justice was so angry that he arrested the prosecuting attorney and acquitted Kiffin. And Kiffin wrote, "Thus did God work deliverance for me and ensnared those who contrived the letter and the work of their own hands. And we, having escaped as a bird out of the snare of the fowler, had great cause to praise his holy name." We go forward a year or two. It's 1663, and a big controversy erupts between the wool merchants and the government. And the wool merchants say, "Mr. Kiffin, would you represent us? We need somebody to go before the Privy Council." And Kiffin says, "I suppose I could do that." This time, King Charles II was there in person. And Kiffin was so impressive in the case he made on behalf of the wool merchants that Charles II loved him. Now, again, Charles II is this deeply immoral man, but he absolutely loved William Kiffin. And he would periodically contact him and chat with him, and he just liked him. And God used that because just a short time after, 12 Baptists were arrested way up in Yorkshire. They had violated an old law, a law passed by Queen Elizabeth 100 years before, and they had been arrested and sentenced to death. And Kiffin found out about it, and he went to King Charles II, directly to King Charles II, and said, "You got to do something about this. These Baptists, I mean, I don't come to you every time a Baptist experiences some kind of trouble, but they're about to execute these men and women, and they are innocent." And King Charles II, on the basis of Kiffin's influence, commuted the sentences and saved those 12 people. Perhaps my favorite Charles II story, though, is he wanted money for a war against the Netherlands. The way kings got money back then was by summoning Parliament. Parliament didn't sit all the time. That's going to be an 18th century development. During this time, kings would summon Parliament, they'd go through an election process, the Parliament would assemble, they would do what the king wants, and then they would disassemble, king would dismiss them. And Charles II did not want to summon Parliament. Parliament had given his dad all kinds of problems. But he needed money. And so he asked Kiffin to come to the court. And Kiffin went, and the king said, "William, can I borrow 40,000 pounds? And Kiffin said, "If it please your majesty, can I make it a gift of 10,000 pounds? And the king said, that'll work, thank you, a gift, thank you, William." And then Kiffin told all his friends, "I just saved myself 30,000 pounds. The rascal was never going to pay me back." But this is a Baptist orphan who's loaning money to the government so they can prosecute wars. And that made enemies. The Duke of Buckingham, who was one of the most powerful people one of the most powerful people in the kingdom, he arrested Kiffin and accused him of conspiring against the king. And when the king found out about it, he said, he's my friend. let him loose. He got arrested in 1670, questioned for treason, no evidence. A couple years later, soldiers showed up and ransacked his house looking for illegal weapons. They couldn't find anything. Those guys were from Monk. 7 times by that time, he had either been arrested, tried, or assaulted by the forces of the government, and no charge would stick. He reminds me of Daniel. That is, if you're going to get this guy, it's only going to be because of his love for God. But God brought other sorrows into his life. His oldest son, William, died in 1669 at the age of 20. Natural causes. It broke Kiffin's heart. It pleased God to take out of the world to himself my eldest son, which was no small affliction to me and my dear wife. The grief I felt for his loss did greatly press me down with more than ordinary sorrow. But in the midst of my great distress, it pleased the Lord to support me by that blessed word being brought powerfully to my mind. Here's the word the Lord brought to his mind. Is thine eye evil because I am good? Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with my own? Anybody know where that text is from? Because that is not the text I would have gone to after I lost a child. It's Matthew chapter 20, the famous parable of the vineyard, where the master hires people for all day for a denarius, and then he hires people in the morning and then at noon, and an hour left, and he pays them all a denarius, and the people who worked all day are complaining. And the master of the vineyard says, it's my money. It's my money. I will give to these as I will give to you. And Kiffin says, you know what? My son didn't belong to me. These words, he writes, did quiet my heart, so that I felt a perfect submission to his sovereign will, being well satisfied that it was for the great advantage of my dear son, and a voice to me to be more humble and watchful over my own ways. Now, it's not wrong to grieve someone's death. I don't think Kiffin is saying we can't grieve. I believe the lament psalms are there for them to be our language. But we're never allowed to be bitter against God for his dispensations. And he had to learn that, because a second son, the one who's not named, we hope was a believer, but he decided he would use some of the wealth that he was born to and travel. And he was traveling around Europe just kind of enjoying himself. Kiffin did very little of this. Kiffin was a pretty hard worker. And he went to Venice, and an Italian, this is a weird story, but here it is. An Italian priest befriended him and sort of became buddies, robbed him, and then poisoned him. And the next time Kiffin sees his son, he's being transported back to England for burial, where he had been murdered in Venice. Shortly thereafter, one of his daughters passed away, the one who's not named. And in 1682, after 44 years of marriage, God took Hannah home to be with the Lord. And Kiffin said, it pleased the Lord to take to himself my dear and faithful wife, with whom I had lived nearly 44 years, whose tenderness to me and faithfulness to God were such as cannot by me be expressed, as she constantly sympathized with me in all my afflictions. What afflictions? Well, he's been dragged to jail 7 times. Yeah, he's rich, but he's not living for money. I can truly say, I never heard her utter the least discontent under all the various providences that attended either me or her. She eyed the hand of God in all our sorrows, so as constantly to encourage me in the ways of God. Her death was the greatest sorrow to me that ever I met with in the world. And in fact, he missed her so bad that he made the biggest blunder of his life. There was a member of his church, a widow, whose name was Sarah Reeve, and he had, as a pastor, comforted Sarah, but it was all very appropriate. He was deeply in love with Hannah. But after he died and she began to comfort him in the loss of his wife, suddenly an attachment formed, way too suddenly. And in April of 1683, 6 months after he buried Hannah, he married Sarah. He was 66 years old. She was a little bit younger. And she was a very poor choice. That is, this is a really good example of a rebound that was not prayed about and thought through carefully. He didn't give enough time, and he finds himself married to somebody who is not going to share in his sufferings the way Hannah did all those years. Well, in 1685, Charles II died. I reported that this morning. The Monmouth Rebellion, I talked about it this morning, where the Duke of Monmouth, James, launches this rebellion. Some really godly people got caught up in that, including two young men by the name of Benjamin and William Hewling. The Hewlings were grandsons of William Kiffin. They were 19 and 20 years old at the time. They were men of sterling character, but they were convinced that we can't let that Catholic take over England, and they got caught up in Monmouth's rebellion. And the rebellion, of course, failed. The Hewling boys were arrested, and Judge Jeffreys, who was vicious, condemned both of them to be hanged. And Kiffin went to James II and begged their lives. He said, "You know how much I did for your brother. You know how loyal I've been to the throne. Please, these are young men. Forgive them. They can learn their lesson." And there was no rescue, and these two boys were hanged. And their final letters out of prison are deeply moving, where they're entrusting their souls to the Lord Jesus. But they shouldn't have gotten caught up in a really bad rebellion. But it absolutely broke Kiffin's heart. And James, showing a deep lack of sensitivity, after meeting with Kiffin and being very impressed by him, called him back to the court and said, "I would like you to take the position of an alderman of London," which was a very prestigious position, and there's no precedent for a Baptist being an alderman. And Kiffin said, "Your Majesty, sire, I'm a very old man." Now, given how old he was at the time, I don't particularly appreciate him saying that. He's 69 years old. When I get that point, I don't think I'm going to agree. But sire, I am a very old man and have withdrawn myself from all kinds of business for some years past, and am incapable of doing any service in such an affair to your Majesty in the city. Besides, sire, the death of my grandsons gave a wound to my heart which is still bleeding, and never will close but in the grave. The bad news is, you can't say no to the king. And James II said, this wasn't actually a negotiation, you're going to be an alderman. And he got appointed alderman despite his attempts to deny it. So what did he do as an alderman for a year? He was a standout alderman. He cared for the poor of the city. He tried to launch a reform for prostitutes. He tried to help people who were widows and widowers. I mean, by the time he was done, the Londoners loved William Kiffin. Well, as I told this morning, James II got run out of London. And William and Mary were invited to come take the throne. And the Baptists were ecstatic. And Kiffin met William on his way to London and gave him a massive cash gift to help him get settled in. And this was not a bribe, this was a gift. This was, "We are so thankful for you guys, thank you for coming." And the Baptists rejoiced greatly for the freedoms. But if you've been following along, this orphan Baptist is probably the only Englishman in the 17th century who knew personally Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, Charles II, James II, and King William. That is, they all knew him by name. They all called him William. That's kind of amazing. When they get these freedoms, when the Act of Toleration is passed in 1689, Baptists all over England say, now's the time for us to organize and expand, and they held a great convocation in London. And at that convocation, they published the Second London Confession, a doctrinal statement that had been written 12 years earlier, 1677, but had never been published. The Second London Confession is arguably the greatest confession of faith ever produced by Baptists. As a dispensationalist, I'm going to differ with them here and there. And there are other aspects of the theology that we could argue about. But what they did, basically, and they say it in their preface, it's a much longer confession than the first one. It's a full doctrinal statement. They took the Westminster Confession of Faith, and everywhere they agreed with it, which was about between 65 and 70%, they just copied it. In fact, in their preface, they say, you will notice that a lot of the Westminster and Savoy statements are in our document. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. That is, they're really good. But then they took all the Presbyterian stuff, all the church-state stuff, all the sacrament stuff, and what I tell my students is they took Westminster and they baptized it. That is, they teach Baptist separation of church and state, and congregational polity, and a memorial Lord's Supper, and believer baptism by immersion, and congregational polity, and on it goes. And you kind of get the richness of Westminster, because Westminster, when it's defining redemption and atonement and adoption, there's no better document. It's amazing. But then you get it coupled with Baptist polity. And so I love the London Confession. But I'm a dispensationalist, so there are places where I don't think they quite get it right. But he was there, and in fact, when they issued it, the first two signers in the list of signers were Knowles, his buddy, and Kiffin. He's the number 2 signer on the document. Well, as we wrap up, in 1692, at the age of 76, friends said, Kiffin, you've had an amazing life. You should write this down. And he did. He wrote an autobiography. If anybody in this room is living a life that warrants an autobiography, don't wait till you're 76, because it is a very rambling document. That is, he doesn't name some of his kids, and he tells stories out of order, and it's kind of a mess. But we do get a lot of the anecdotes. 6 years later, his sufferings were not at an end. His son, Harry, at the age of 44, passed away. It's very hard to bury a child, and now this is the 4th one he's had to bury. And then his wife, Sarah. His wife, Sarah, apparently was really causing problems because the church had to bring her before the assembly for church discipline. She was accused of deceit, theft, lying, and falsely accusing her husband. That's ugly. That's ugly. When the pastor's wife is being disciplined out of the church, things have badly unraveled. She was unrepentant and was excommunicated. I doubt their marriage was great from then on. we don't know very much about it. He's nearing the end. But that's kind of a sad thing to have to do when you are 82 years old. Young people in here, pray a lot before you marry. Your marriage partner is the second most important decision you will ever make. Well, Devonshire Square Baptist Church had a co-pastor after about 1690, but Kiffin just kept serving right up until 1701 when he died at the ripe old age of 85. We don't bury a lot of 85-year-olds in the 17th century. God had blessed him tremendously, and they buried him in Bunhill Fields, same place where Bunyan's buried. Interestingly, though, Kiffin's grave has been long lost. We know he's in there somewhere with all the other nonconformists, but we're not exactly sure where. Many of the graves have been lost. So what does Kiffin's life teach us? Number one, Kiffin, you've been working all along. Let's keep working. There you go. Kiffin served God with what he had. What's in your hand? Probably not as much wealth as in his hands. Probably not access to rulers. But whatever's in your hands, you give to the Lord. That's what Kiffin did. Believers, all believers are destined to suffer. We saw that this morning. If somebody like Kiffin is dragged off to jail 7 times, we may suffer as well. And then maybe the lesson that I want to emphasize most relative to Kiffin is that he loved God more than he loved God's gifts. And I want to close with a Kiffin quote, and then I'll have a theme verse. I do have a theme verse. It's just going to be the last slide. A Kiffin quote in which, as he was nearing death, he had heirs. He had a couple surviving kids. He had grandkids. And he knows he's going to leave them all this money. That is, he was an orphan who, by the blessing of God, went from 0 to millions. His kids and grandkids are suddenly going to have millions. And he was worried about it. And so he wrote them a letter, being now sensible of the decays of nature. That's a nice way to say, I'm dying. And the great inability that attends me thereby to do service for Jesus Christ. The counsel I would leave with you is, first, have a care of your hearts, that they be not taken with the vanities of this present evil world. Your temptations may be more than mine were in my younger days, in regard that your means of enjoying the world are much more. That is, when I was an orphan and I was dirt poor, I wasn't all that tempted to be materialistic. Now, poor people can be materialistic, but he says, your temptation is going to be enormous. But yet consider, it is an evil requital to the Lord for the mercies shown to your father, that what God hath given him and hath been left by him to you should be used to sin against that God who hath freely given it. Oh, let not that which your father hath received as mercy from God be so used that at last it may prove a curse to you. He says, I would be brokenhearted if I left you this wealth and it caused you to love God less. I have often prayed from the hands of God that you may have another portion than the world in this life, that Christ may be your portion. This has been the desire of my soul to God for you. Here's a rich guy, and you kind of get a hint as to why God entrusted all that money to him. Because he just kept on loving God. He didn't become a lover of money. And that statement, I have often prayed to God that he would give you another portion, that Christ would be your portion, a better portion than this world. That brings to my mind Asaph in Psalm 73. And that's my theme verse for our lesson tonight. Whom have I in heaven? Remember the context of this? Asaph is looking at worldly people, and worldly people seem to be doing great. They're living long lives, and they've got lots of wealth, and they're prospering. And Asaph says, Lord, why are they doing well and we're suffering? My feet had almost slipped. And then I went into the assembly and I considered their end. And I realized that like brute beasts, they're just being fattened for slaughter. They're on their way to destruction. And then Asaph utters this prayer. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And Kiffin is an example of somebody with great gifts and opportunities, great trials and suffering. Neither of them caused him to turn inward on himself and become an idolater. In both, he consecrated him to the Lord. And he had his faults. You know, a bad marriage to a bad woman is a bad fault. But he loved God. And I want to love God like that, with whatever he puts in my hands and whatever he brings in my path. All right, let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you so much for these folk and their kindness in coming out tonight. And Lord, I pray that the life of William Kiffin, which in many ways is stranger than fiction, would be a challenge to us. We don't have anything like his life. Our gifts and talents are very different. Our opportunities are different, and our sufferings are different. But Lord, I pray that we would have you as our portion. And so whatever you allow in our lives, whether good or bad, would not cause us to worship ourselves, but would turn our hearts to you. And that you would give us grace to respond. And thank you that for so much of his life, his testimony was one of being all out for you and using all that you did in him and to him to bless others. Give us grace in that area, I pray, and I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.